I just want to start off by sort of asking a question to the panel. We can rotate the answers around. How do you get the programmers to start thinking in this paradigm? Because this is not how they've been trained traditionally to work.
That's sort of an interesting question. So at Guild, I feel it was largely an experiment to try to do this to accelerate their velocity. And once there were a few examples under their hat that were successful, just sharing that with the rest of the team and showing the clear advantages of solving problems in that way versus contributing to that large monolithic application. And largely, I feel we as developers, like when we have problems, we're trying to address our own pain, and so a lot of the things we have done have been to address our own pain and solve our own problems.
Yeah, I fully agree. At Halo, we had a pretty similar journey. Initially, obviously, it's a big cultural change, and some people don't believe in it. Others are reluctant to go for it. But as you move on and as you start actually piloting some projects and seeing the benefits, then it's obviously way easier thing to sell to people and to convince them. At Halo, we invested a lot in development tooling. So actually, once a lot of the things were out in terms of continuous delivery, in terms of insights about how your services are performing, then when we demonstrated that it was actually a very, very easy sell, people naturally starting building things and accelerating the migration even in their own time, because it's very easy to see the benefits when you can actually work on your own thing and deploy it on your own, and you don't have to depend on different teams or no one. You can basically just focus on what needs to get done and done it as quickly as possible. And you also have, in the end, all the tools that are needed to see how your thing is performing, how your thing is behaving. Yeah, it's at that stage, it's quite easy to reason about that and to give it to other teams.
So I think I agree with what everyone is saying here. For us, like microservices enable us to run things in parallel. Like every team manages their own responsibilities in terms of the services that they run. So we can basically develop, like on the things that we need to serve to others, like on our own, while making sure that everything that we need is being run independently by other teams. So I think it helps us organizationally, like it breaks things up. Responsibilities are more clear. There are clear service boundaries. So I think that's pretty much like why we try to do microservices, and that's how like engineers are trained to think. If they are providing a service, it's basically like a service that is exposed with an API on the network.
What's your human day-to-day process of saying this microservice has grown to be too big and it's time to split it up?
I think the question was, what is the time when you call out that a microservice has become too large? So I think my answer to that would be that when, it's a single responsibility principle, right? Like it depends what was the initial goal of the service. Now, if someone is conflating too many things in the service, that's when that the service is becoming two things. It's not domain specific anymore. If it's crossing two different domains and things like that, that's when personally I would I would call out that a service is becoming too large.
I mean, certainly one of the signs that I've used in the past is if you describe the service to me and you use the word "and," it's two services.
For me, it is it's when you start encountering difficulties when like reasoning and trying to make changes to a service. So like at Guild, we've split down services several times. So there's that initial implementation. Those ran for quite a while, and then we just got to a point where some of those the domain sort of makes sense, but it's became really big and just very, very hard to make any changes within a reasonable amount of time, which is when we felt that we need to break those down to maintain that development velocity.
So, is this, okay. So you guys have all spoken about catalogs of services that are many hundreds or thousands deep, and I'm wondering what you do to facilitate awareness of the existing capabilities among, what in some cases are really large development teams, so you don't get redundancy and whatnot.
Yeah, I guess I'll start, but it's a long answer, as you can imagine, and it's a very valid question. So the question was, how do we basically give the awareness about what the services do, especially when they get into the hundreds? And when do you know if you're going to build something new, basically if it's not already there? Service catalog is a very good thing, actually. We have a service catalog. Basically, there is a service that every time you deploy something, this service will go and interrogate it and say, tell me what you do. And because we have well-defined APIs, that's already there. So this goes on a portal, and if you're looking for something, basically you just type metadata, and it will show you all the services that have anything to do with that. Also, when you start a new project, we have a specific room, and you can basically use our chat ops for creating new projects only in that room. So you have to announce what service are you building, and in 2 sentences, what it's supposed to be doing. When you do that, this also gives the awareness of everyone else what you're about to do, and if someone can see a different way of doing it, for example, by reusing components and without having to actually build something new, they'll point you in the right direction. And yeah, that's how we do it.
So at Netflix, we are not technically solving that problem. I think we have solved it organizationally. So for example, the membership team is going to be making microservices related to membership. Like I am in cloud platform engineering, we make services which are more like at the infrastructure level. There are teams like the cloud persistent teams, like they will give you like cache as a service or distributed storage as a service. So if I need something related to membership, I will talk to the membership team, and they would either point me to a service or write a new service for me, or the playback team is going to be writing services around playback. So we have solved it based on like the organizational hierarchy.
You mentioned that the different transitions from your monolithic code bases to your microservices, but never really talked a lot about how difficult and how painful that is, and it actually can cause a lot of friction, keep people from being, make them reluctant to move on to that new idea. What are your tips or tricks to easing that transition? Do you can you speak about ways of making it painless for people?
I think the enterprises I've worked with, we tend to be very upfront about what we're doing. We're going to do this differently. We talk about how we're even going to organize differently. And because I'm working in environments where we also have legacy systems, we give them a choice. If you like your role and your responsibilities you have currently, you can stay in the existing systems. You want to play with the new stuff, we have new roles and responsibilities you will have to sign up for. And generally, we also give them different titles as well. So we kind of make it a volunteer operation, but try to put a lot of carrots in there to sort of draw them in the right direction. That being said, I've worked with enterprises where a large portion of the development team would quit. 20, 30, 40% may even leave because they'd rather keep their title as a Java lead developer than to sort of embrace some of the newer technologies and become operationally skilled as well. And frankly, we don't want those guys around in this new world. Other answers?
I think this sums it up.
So just a follow-up question.
Oh, sorry, this one, you'll be next.
Oh, okay. Just a follow-up question on that. When you are transitioning from a monolith to a microservice platform, how do you see that transition? It's a rewrite of the entire application, or you're gradually splitting that entire monolith into 4 services, gradually 10, and then it's entire microservice architecture?
Sorry, you talked about how you transition from the monolith into a services. Is it kind of just a giant rewrite, or is there a gradual process?
At Guild, it's been iterative to a degree. So we've tried to really identify what problems we're having and pull and in a lot of cases that involves writing a new service to encompass a new sphere of responsibility. And so we like he was saying in his presentation, what a common theme I saw is just like you're trying to make these backwards compatible changes so that you can like roll forward and test some stuff and roll back if there are problems. And sorry, I just lost my track of mind there for.
It's pretty much spot on. It's iterative development, right? You start by solving the most crucial pain points, either being continuous delivery or something around that. And once you have like the bare bones of this, you can start focusing on your core application, see what is the low-hanging fruit, and basically as a prototype, just migrate those pieces onto a new platform, see how those things work and scale. And yeah, you take it from there and you continue to move on, iterate, identify different pieces of your legacy platform that are first suitable for actually being migrated. If you have some, I don't know, complicated payment system, you probably don't want to touch that or leave it to the last. Yeah, if I'm going to run a transition, in this case, I will probably leave that for the last. But yeah, anything else that is less painful, you can probably focus on and chunk it into like proper domain services. And at some point, you have enough to start building newer things. And at that point, most of the teams will start actually using the new platform for basically creating new business logic. And from then on, the migration part becomes actually very obvious and easy because you reach a state where the development onto the legacy system starts dialing down while the rest ramps up. And it's also afterwards basically just saying, okay, so let's take the time to rewrite this piece or that piece, or probably there are pieces that are actually fine to stay as they are. I mean, some things might be better left untouched. I don't know. I guess it depends on the complexity there and the engineering velocity and people that you have.
I guess in my experience, about 10% of the people I'm doing microservices just started doing microservices because they're startups. I would say of the remainder, about a third basically had to throw away a monolith and rewrite it from scratch and kind of went through that particular pain. But 2/3 are pretty much just taking a monolith and gradually trying to put all the new functionality in microservices that are possible and gradually migrate it over time. And certainly when we're working with large enterprise clients, it's been more the case that we'll put new functionality in microservices by extracting information out of existing databases and data warehouses and into the service boundaries, doing our operations inside services, and then pushing some transaction or some sort of answer back into the legacy system. And that's worked quite well for us as we start these guys on that path of migration. Yes, sir.
My question is, it seems all three of you guys are using AWS. Did you find that deploying microservices and deploying some of the technology was easier, quicker path, if you will, by using a service like AWS?
So at Guild, we actually just recently switched to AWS. One of the primary reasons for us in doing so is we've wanted to leverage a lot more of the AWS infrastructure, like rather than rather than hosting our own databases and requiring days to get that provisioned, I can just use an RDS instance and I'll be ready in like 30 minutes, and that's not a blocker at all anymore. And like just leveraging those technologies and then moving our services closer to where we're getting our information from just made sense to us.
Yeah, likewise. In our case, we started even with our monoliths on top of AWS. So we had a lot of learnings there about how not to do things on top of AWS. And to be honest, those learnings have been great for us because they actually showed us the right way of doing it. And having something like Amazon is great, especially if you're a new business, because this means that you basically pay as you go for the things that you use. And as your user base starts ramping up, you don't have to think about capacity planning and things like that. You basically just turn on auto-scaling if your application supports that on the software layer. And yeah, it just works for you. Also, the pace of innovation in terms of AWS services that's being rolled out constantly is very, very high, meaning that for greenfield projects, if you need to basically cut some corners in order to deliver an MVP, you can reuse a lot of the things that they give you for free. And yeah, get there as quickly as possible.
Quick question. How are the teams structured around these services? And in a traditional enterprise where there are many domains, how would you organize teams around these different services? And probably this is for Fred.
So what we do typically is we have teams which are which are making services for a particular domain. So we have playback team which has a bunch of things related to playback related things. Then my team, for example, we write services which everyone else in Netflix is going to be using, lower level services. Problems that other microservices won't want to solve, for example, service discovery or IPC or Zookeeper, deploying Zookeeper at scale, those kind of things. So the organizational boundary is very domain specific.
True, but do you have a dedicated teams that will always have bench strength around those services?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Your mic was off.
Do you always have people staffed onto those services, whether there is an active development or not?
Yeah, so engineers in those services, they decide what to do with those services. They are independent to make any design decisions that they are taking. As long as the API that they expose to the outer world doesn't change or break, it's fine. It's cool.
Okay.
I've definitely felt it's important as you're building these teams working on microservices that you're embedding some architectural skills as well as the operational skills. Yeah. That these are not just, pick a set of university programmers and drop them into a team. You need to make sure you have that mixture of skills and experiences within that group. But then you basically turn them loose because they'll figure out good answers on their own. They're good about algorithms.
Thanks. So on that same line of thinking, from the perspective of the consumers of the services, what do you recommend? Where do you recommend that the service composition actually happen? At the higher level, or is there another intermediate layer of services that now is responsible for going out and talking to individual microservices?
Can you summarize the question?
I'm sorry, we didn't quite understand the question.
So from a perspective of service composition, so you have a number of microservices, right? Where do you recommend that the consumers of your services do that composition? At a higher level or somewhere intermediate?
Yeah, again, it's a good question about service composition, and I can't say there is a right answer. Really, there are many options that you can take depending on the use case. Some people go for basically UI kind of mashups and composition, and they do that on that layer. Other people have used some form of orchestrator patterns, so they have internal services that coordinate others to produce some business logic. Also, there is the API gateway pattern where you basically put a lot of this into your front API. And as you code this API, it will do the required calls for the internal services, effectively masking the complexity of the front end. Different ways at Halo, to be honest, we do all three of them, depending on the use case.
In my experience, I've been mostly using event-bus architectures, and therefore most of the services are very small and self-contained, and participating in the bus is basically as low-level peers. So there isn't really a God service or even necessarily interfacing services in that environment. But it's a highly decoupled environment.
I have a question for Diptanu from Netflix. I was interested in what you said about using client-side load balancing, and I'm wondering if you have anything in your stack or in your huge selection of microservices that's not written by you, like maybe some external stuff. In which case, how would it be able to speak to other services if it's not using your IPC library?
So that's an interesting question. I don't think like I know about anything which is not written by us. So we pretty much like roll our own. Yeah.
I think you had a question up here. We'll repeat your question. Go ahead.
Yeah. So question is, I know you all three of you are predominantly AWS clients. So have you folks explored alternate platforms like Azure or any other cloud platforms that are being made available in the new era?
I guess like everything else at Halo, it's on a case-by-case basis. If there is something that we can use, obviously, first we look at AWS because it's just, we have so many tools around that, and we have a long-lasting relationship. Again, when the tool that we're using is not good enough, we start looking at the other providers and see if we can't use something from their stack. We've been having cases, for example, where we would be using a lot of Redshift, but then we see that, for example, BigQuery from GC is basically giving us more functionality for what we need. So we can be using both. In our case, that's perfectly fine and valid because we have a lot of abstractions that allow us to be very flexible around that.
Okay, so your abstraction layer is actually allowing you to change and replatform.
It depends how deeply we want to integrate with GC, right? Obviously, if we actually start running workloads on GC, that would require us to change some of the orchestration paths. And that said, everything else will continue to run as it is. In terms of just using things like data warehousing, we just pipe events and data, that's it. I mean, the only thing we have to do is build a service that basically understands the BigQuery API, and that's it. Done. As simple as that.
Okay. Hi. Okay, so I have a question. Do either any of you have any like laws or regulations or I don't know, like audit compliant items that you have to deal with in the microservices or in your industries, where, for example, you're not allowed to be touching production or you're not allowed to be touching like client specific data because it's financial data or very tax sensitive data. Like, I'm hearing a lot about. You own your stack, you own your service from the beginning to the end. It's, you're changing everything in production all the time, every time. So what kind of challenges do you guys, or what do you do if you're faced with some sort of laws and regulations where you have to have this separation of duty between production and client-sensitive data versus lower environments?
We've had a case like that, but to be honest, obviously, it's very important to understand what are the requirements when you design your microservices system, because it goes very deep into how you deal with data persistence, data at rest, all those things. So compliance is very important to get right from the beginning. To be more specific, we had a use case where, for example, we transferred the credit card information from our customers to PSPs, right? And to achieve that without having our old platform being under PCI scope, this delaying our delivery and having to do actual sign-offs for every service we write and every new version we want to deploy, what we do is we basically always try to focus on making the scope as small as possible, so reducing the scope of those business processes. In our specific case, what we do is we have a totally different API which gets this data, encrypts it using Amazon KMS, And from then on, it just sends encrypted data within our platform, so that's all fine. As it leaves our platform, it goes to another service which is governed in a different way, and it follows all like the PCI change management daunting processes that you can imagine. And yeah, it decrypts it and it sends it to like the third-party providers. So if I have to answer it with one sentence, basically trying to reduce the scope for those processes as much as possible.
I haven't had any personal experience in this with microservices, but I have before I got into microservices. And my observation has been in a lot of cases the regulatory bodies are not the ones you're wrestling with. It's your own internal group that's codified that in some way. If you go back to regular, and basically you codified it around existing processes you already had in place. So when you move to microservices, there's a huge mismatch between the in-place processes in your organization and the microservice architectures. But if you go back to first principles, what they're trying to look at, in this case, either SOX or FDA, the ones I've had experience with, you can rework these processes very elegantly into a microservice world. In the case of microservices, we have teams of people that deploy the microservices, so there's not a single individual able to do that on their own. That gets past a lot of the SOX compliance issues, for example. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a question on how does microservices tie in with the people who support the microservices? So Fred, you mentioned this a little bit, that you have the Java guy who doesn't want to change the mindset and then he might leave after a while. But if you are going to embark in a microservice way of thinking, will you expect to have a big organizational restructure that comes along with it? Or does it naturally just happen? How does those two things balance together?
Well, the long answer to that will be my presentation at 4:30. But yeah, I think to some degree, if you don't put a corresponding set of changes in place, you wind up with trying to deploy microservices in an environment that has traditional op structures. Then the traditional op structure is going to take 3 or 4 weeks to get something out the door that you took half a day to write. There's a huge impedance mismatch. You're not getting the benefits. So I think there's some corresponding both technologies, processes, and organizational issues associated with it. I think, to some degree, each of your companies has wrestled with this. You transitioning from a big Ruby monolith into microservices. Organizational impacts as well?
Yes. So when we started doing that big shift, we also made a shift to how teams work, and we set up KPIs. And there was a lot of work to communicate to the business end how these KPI things were going to work, which was largely that the tech teams are going to be autonomous, and as long as they're driving their KPIs, if you come to them with something, they might say no because it doesn't drive their KPIs. And that was a big cultural shift. And the hard part is, of course, coming up with those KPIs, and you definitely need to agree on those with the business side, so the business side feels comfortable. And then, once we had those in place, it just opened up a whole lot of rapid development and experimentation and possibilities.
I guess this is a related question. How much autonomy do developers have in choosing technologies and languages? And I guess the second part of that question is, and how does management change? How has management changed in like this decentralized, I guess, microservices environment? What kind of question? How have management structures changed?
So I guess in Netflix's case, it depends on the infrastructure that a service is going to leverage. Like for example, like most of our IPC stack and most of our libraries for doing core infrastructure is in Java. So people choose Java, but it doesn't mean people don't write stuff in Node.js. Like the website, for example, Netflix.com now is powered by Node.js, mostly Node.js, I would say. What they have done is they have chosen the technology based on the strengths of the team members and based on what made sense for them. So I guess like it totally depends, at Netflix at least, it totally depends on the engineers in the team who is running the service. No, they didn't. They use something called Prana, which is our sidecar. So the Node.js talks to a sidecar which has all the Java libraries, which is talking back to the other Java services. Yeah.
I think in a case of clients I've worked with, we tended to be very polylingual in terms of languages we use. We use the right language for the right job. In a rewrite of a major website in the UK, we use Ruby to drive the front end. We use Clojure to do the heavy lifting. And we use Node.js to do traffic monitoring. So it's kind of the right language for the right job. What we found was the programmers adopt these languages quite easily. One or two may know it, and by judicious teaming and rotating and paired programming, the knowledge flows around very eloquently. And it doesn't have to be 100% of people understand 100% of the languages, just that they have enough people to handle any given issue in any given day. The management in that environment was basically almost non-existent because we basically made more autonomous teams. Teams knew what their goals were, the KPIs, and we gave them pretty much freedom to do what they needed to do.
Yeah, at Gelt, we're primarily a Scala shop, but we also have a bunch of code in Ruby, and we're actually running an experiment with Node.js right now. So we're firm believers in picking the right tools for the job, but at the same time, we sort of recognize that the more tools and languages that are in play, the harder we start generating some friction, where if I left my team and decided that I wanted to go to work for another team, then suddenly all my tools potentially change. So as we're growing and adding those, we try to focus on making sure that our tools sort of work consistently to reduce that amount of friction when we do stuff like that.
You're strictly Go.
Yeah, we're 99% Go well. The thing is, it's APIs, right? You can use any language you want. We still have some Java services, like small enough there in the mass. But as everyone else said, the challenge is not the language and how you communicate to the different services. The challenge at that point is you start being on your own in terms of a lot of the visibility and the tooling that you have in your ecosystem in one language and you don't have available in the others. So if the team is big enough, and obviously they have a big task to achieve, and they have chosen a different language, that's all good. The only thing they have to do is basically use sidecars or in some cases like write their own libraries in order to basically match that, because when you go to such a granular architecture, having visibility is very, very important, and having things conform to those APIs. For example, if you're going to do tracing, which is pretty much mandatory, or if you're going to add circuit breakers, you really need to have those things available everywhere. If you don't, then there will be cascading failure and you wouldn't find out why.
Okay. Yes. Oh, sorry, the mic over here? Yes, sir, your question?
Yeah, hi. My question was about clients, and I'm wondering if you've experienced any pushback or any sense that client development has gotten any more difficult when you're using microservices. Have you found in particular that there's less commonality in the APIs across microservices because they're developed independently? Different data types, different schemas, different styles of API development. Has that caused friction with client developers?
Client developers being?
Whoever's calling the APIs. I mean, client application developers. And in some cases, it could even be other services that are just consuming multiple other services.
So is sort of the chaotic nature of the microservices and consistency across the APIs make it easier for using them in general? Is that the question?
Yeah, the question is, has it been difficult to make them consistent enough?
Difficult to make them consistent enough for clients.
Can you summarize that question? Sorry.
Yes, it's the, have you found that microservices, it's difficult to get consistency across the APIs so that people writing to these APIs are not struggling with lots of different styles and et cetera?
Well, at Guild, like we've started moving toward API doc, and since those clients are auto-generated, that provides a certain consistency across there.
Yeah, same. We use protobots, so our APIs are well defined, and we have a lot of auto generation, especially if you're going to code those things from JS or whatever. So this is all there for you. But back to the question, when you have so many services, it's actually hard, and so many teams and individuals writing them, it's actually hard to be very specific about, I don't know, how you structure that. Some people do pagination in one way, others do it in another way. I guess at that point, it's, again, the ecosystem that you have around your microservices platform that helps being able to auto-generate those clients in the more, like, not having to deal with understanding those APIs in a very granular level would be the way to go, I guess.
In my experience also, it's so easy to change these microservices that if I do put out what my clients consider a clumsy API or an inconsistent API, it's usually been very easy to just put release 2 out there the next day and clean it up. Because we are looking for that level of feedback at each team level. So not deliberately go out there. We don't usually have any holy wars over styles, for example. Not like editorial wars that we've had in the past.
Thank you.
I saw a hand up here. Lots of hands over here.
Hey, I've got a quick. Hello. I've got a quick question. To come back to your point about versioning as much as anything else, it strikes me that a lot of the APIs you guys are talking about are sort of reconciling internal systems to each other, internal APIs. So, of public-facing APIs, some of the different ways of versioning them could be interesting in terms of the marshalling pattern, the proxy pattern. I'd love to hear about some of the experiences you guys have had of versioning the external-facing APIs to external consumers with microservices, sort of enforcing patterns in REST. Maybe I think that may have been a little bit of the question that was just asked, but I'd love to hear if you have any sort of specific experiences you could share there.
Externally facing APIs.
So I think for externally facing APIs, at least from what I've seen is what we do is we make sure that the API is backward compatible for a specific period of time. And obviously you can't have a API backward compatible forever. At some stage you have to break, but then give people enough time to move out of it. With internal APIs, it's much more simple. It's maybe the duration is a few months to a quarter. Maybe for public APIs, it's much more. So externally when you say external, is it within your company's ecosystem or? Frankly, I don't think we have a lot of problem there. We basically do it. I mean, as far as I remember, I don't think we never had a problem with backward compatibility. Whenever we had to break something, we broke by giving people a lot of time to move out of it, 6 months, and then we break.
I think in my experience, we've had more trouble with the external APIs of services that we're using, exploiting rather than our own internal APIs that we're publishing to other third parties. That we don't always get notice that somebody has changed. And our policy was we isolate each external service with its own microservice, so that because we know each one's going to get changed and broke at its individual rates. But I haven't had a lot of experience about publishing external APIs, a la Google advertising sort of thing. I don't have any experience with publishing external APIs with that.
Hi, my question is specific to Guilt and your problem that you ran into with your design decisions on your microservices between your web app notifications and non-web app. And your solution was to actually move those two services into your core, which I'm kind of blind to, but I was curious to know what prompted you to move them into your core versus redesigning your microservices in general to have different relationships and leave it abstracted out.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that.
So I'm wondering why you chose to shift your two services, one for your mobile apps notifications and then your non-mobile, to, you said, the core of the app, which I'm not sure what that means, versus keeping it abstracted but redefining the relationships between your microservices. Like, what was the thought process in making that decision?
So you're talking primarily about my list example?
Yes.
So when I said core, I meant essentially the base services behind the domain. So I had that initial slide where like there's a service for the management and there's a service for the notification, and then there ended up being all these other services on top. And so like when we noticed those and we noticed those problems, we like sat down together and we're like, okay, this design isn't great. There are these problems we've encountered. There's these other problems that we're likely to encounter. How can we solve this? And in as graceful a manner as possible. And so like our goal was to just to go back to having the one thing responsible for that functionality and doing it well. And so it essentially came down. So we didn't really redesign anything. And the example of the notification, that was just additional functionality that really should have been within the one service, and just the team that had built that probably would have been better off contributing to the service that was already in existence rather than spinning up their new thing, and that was just largely due to a lack of sitting down and thinking about the overall scope of what waitlist is and how all the components interact.
I think we have time for one more question before lunch. I think you've been waiting a long time. Sorry, guys.
Hi. The question is it common to have your microservices communicate with the database directly, or is there usually some kind of layer in between that helps?
At Gilt, we're trying to move towards if a service has a lot of data, then it should own its own data, and we're actually moving to smaller databases that are essentially tied to those services. At the same time, we still have a very large monolithic database, as cutting up and restructuring a database is a lot harder than cutting apart a service and spinning up microservices.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. At Halo, we basically have each service has its own data, and that's how it is. We never have the case where two services share database or something like that.
Same here. I was just going to say that, first of all, I mean, at Netflix, it's the same. Services own their data. The thing is, the read and write patterns of different services will be like totally different or can be different. So in that case, like sharing the same databases are probably not the right choice anyways, because then you won't be able to scale up or scale down the data tier easily.
And at the Microservice conference in Berlin, one of the people from Six Wunderkinder was talking about their app. And it was a Rails app moving into microservices. And the first thing they said they really did was tear the database apart. Before they try to just separate the database into lots of small databases, then I can start attacking the other problem. Then he felt that if they didn't break the database apart first, they would never be successful with the microservice approach.
There is also the busy neighbor problem. Like someone might be hitting the database more than some other service, and then both the services get degraded.
All right, so I think that's all we have time before lunch. So let's give our applause for the participants.